Welcome to Darshan Talks, powered by the Kulkarni Law Firm. This podcast explores the challenges and opportunities facing FDA-regulated companies. Join us as we discuss the latest trends, news, and insights with experts and executives in the field.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. My name is Darshan Kulkarni. I'm here with the famous Jeffrey DiFrancesco, and Jeffrey and I have actually worked together multiple times before. We're excited because we're going to talk about mergers, we're going to talk about acquisitions, and we're going to take this idea of a hypothetical company, this hypothetical company is looking to buy some life sciences companies, and what do they consider? But before we get started, Jeffrey, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is, again, Jeff DiFrancesco. Welcome and thank you, Darshan, for the opportunity for me to speak with you and your audience. I have 20 plus years experience in the life science and healthcare industry. And what I've focused on are working with companies that have a disruptive technology and helping them create value and monetize them. My company is called Advancer Group. And what we are composed of are three individuals who have expertise in technology, organizational design, and business. And we've worked with lots of clients in the healthcare and life science space, both in terms of establishing their business from idealization to realization. We've also worked with established companies that are looking to enter new markets or developing new products. And as part of that, we also have worked with companies to improve their success when it comes to acquiring new technologies or businesses. So that's the basis of our conversation today.
So Jeff, let me start with a really basic question, which is, why should a company consider either a merger or an acquisition? Why not just grow something in-house? When does an M&A make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that simple question many times are not necessarily understood up front. And a lot of times it's around specific assets. So if you have a specific therapeutic area, a specific product that exists that might be complementary to your particular market, that would make a possibility. Or you may want to get geographically be able to enter in, maybe you're a US based firm and you want to be able to get into Europe. That might also be an approach where there might be certain distribution channels that can be leveraged, or manufacturing. So there's a variety of factors that allow companies to accelerate into a particular market, or that would otherwise be more difficult from an organic perspective. But that being said, there's always a trade-off when it comes to organically growing versus having a merger and acquisition, which is one of the challenges that I think we'll be talking about today.
So let's talk about those challenges, right? So let's say I am, as I mentioned in the intro, let's say I am a sort of holding group, and I have X number of millions or billions in assets, and I'm going, I want to choose the right fit, and I want to choose a couple of new assets to add to my portfolio. When you get called in, how are you helping them think through that process? Because they've got the money. It's what's the right fit?
Yeah, what's interesting about we're brought in typically when they are already have some sort of intention. And what happens is that momentum happens quickly. Typically, the parties that are involved in terms of legal counsel, investment bank that they may be working with, as well as the board members and the C-suite of the company, start to have a very vested interest in terms of having success and completing the acquisition itself. The challenge, though, is that what was initially identified as a great opportunity, as you get into the details of the structure, um, those risks start to show themselves. And what we can be helpful with is helping to start to be an honest broker of what are some of the real questions that you should be considering to make sure that both upfront that the acquisition is a great opportunity and fit, but also how do you make sure that you post acquisition that that there's success in the integration between the different company assets. And so those are, when you look at historically, 50 to 80% of all acquisitions fail to achieve their intended goal. And with such a high failure rate, the question here is how do you increase that success? And that's an area in which we focus.
So, few different questions. So the first question I have is, you talked about how these companies are looking for these synergies, if you will, for lack of a better term, and they're looking to find the group that's going to help them take 1 + 1 and make it 4. Where do you start looking? Is it just people applying and asking for money, or asking friends and family, or is there a a better, cleaner process to sort of apply for the money and to acquire these potential fits, if you will?
Yeah, it's there is a well-established process in terms of going through a merger and acquisition. There's firms that specialize in that, both from a financial perspective, putting together the perspective, what the story is, collecting all of the data that is required from a due diligence perspective, and obviously both sides of the organizations, both the company that is acquiring as well as being acquired, there's a tremendous amount of focus by the respective leadership when it comes to providing all the support around making that acquisition happen. The challenge, though, is that once this happens, and I've been both on the side of the company acquiring as well as being on the receiving end, and there is a level of urgency that overwhelms a lot of the more basic questions that need to be assessed when it comes to make sure that, is this really a great fit? And this is no different than any human relationship. So we're talking about a business relationship. Think about human relationships and how that develops over time, and how what maybe was a early interest and how you believe that relationship would be a great fit, and then over time you realize that just isn't. And what we act in those instances is to make sure that those fundamental questions about, is this a good relationship, are constantly being asked as information, as due diligence takes place, as you start to look at prospectively, what is this new entity that's going to be created. So that's the first thing that we do, is to make sure that we are asking the right questions. And the second part of it is can we ask those questions truly as an independent arbiter of what is happening. Everyone from corporate counsel, third-party corporate counsel, the investment banks, even the management in many instances are purely focused on making the acquisition happen. But it's important to make sure that there's someone who is neutral, that doesn't have that vested interest, to really be challenging the fundamentals about what was the original intent. And as you go through this process, that you're constantly asking, is this still a good fit? And then the third is we could act as a mirror just being able to constantly reflect, saying, hey, is this what you wanted to do? Is this actually showing up as we get into this, as we get into the details of the structure itself?
So it's interesting. You talk about the importance of the good fit. And the good fit is really important in that that's where the synergies come from. But here's my question. Um, I feel like what you start with isn't necessarily where you end up. So the good fit almost evolves. So how
Yep.
do you know um, whether the good fit should be evaluated based on original intent or final intent, or is that slippery slope just part of the process and you have to keep evaluating the entire time?
That's great. So, well, let's look at what some of the one way of answering your question, which is the right question, is looking at what are typical areas of failure. And one is just making sure that there's a sound strategic rationale to the merger or acquisition. So, is that truly visible? Is it something that at the board level, at the C-suite level of both parties, and making sure that whatever that original intent, the question you asked initially, is that something that everyone agrees with? The second part of that is that if you have a well-defined strategic rationale, then the question here is, what does that actual future state look like? And obviously that's more than looking at it from an asset perspective. It's looking at the human aspect and other factors. So let's talk about what some of those other factors are. So one is making sure that alignment of expectations is tangible. So when someone says, this is what success looks like, is that something that is measurable, that everyone can agree with? Because it's important to go from that qualitative to a quantitative expectation on what success look like and how quickly that can be realized, and what does that actually mean. The other important is looking at things like just cultural. If you're dealing with a merger and acquisition that's across different geographies, different domains, it's important to understand what are the cultural aspects, and is that something that you could have consensus around. Another area is just having clear due diligence. If due diligence is not just technical, it's not just compliance, it's not just financial. A due diligence can be cultural. Due diligence can be how the organization is going to operate post. So these are all questions that in many instances are lost through a more traditional view of what a merger and acquisition is. Some additional areas is making sure that as you get into the details of what the organization looks like after the fact, making sure that what is the real value of that relationship. Well, many instances the value is established up front, but as you get into the details and realizing what is it going to actually take to realize that value, there has to be an openness to look back and say, maybe the value is not what we expected and we need to adjust it. And that could, the risk is that can go either up or it can go down, but you have to have a willingness to understand, because in many instances, these are not all cash deals. These are usually a combination of cash or all equity, or a combination of both. And so you need to look at what that value is, which then brings us into what is the structure of the financing, and are there earnouts pertaining to this? How do you kind of create those types of incentives? So one is what the value of it is, the other is what's the structure of that value. And then others is just looking at it from a integration perspective. One of the biggest areas is that there's typically, integration looks as if it's something's going to happen instantaneously, and we all realize that isn't true, and so you have to factor in, what does integration actually look like, including putting in the right project management or program management around that integration, putting in the right incentives around and stakeholder alignment around that integration, but also making sure that financially you're budgeting for that. And it goes back to the valuation decision. Integration is not an inconsequential cost, and you need to be able to look at upfront that is part of the transaction, and making sure that is fully loaded into your budgets, which in many instances this is a multi-year process of integrating. Other areas is, from a regulatory perspective, and you're better than I to factor that in, but looking at from a compliance regulatory, if these are organizations that have high concentration in one or more markets, there may be certain regulatory constraints about, and that needs to be, again, looked at in terms of valuation, structure, and then is that still a good deal based upon some of the regulatory oversight that may result. And some of the last is just looking at key personnel, and hopefully the whole organization is in the forefront, but there are going to be certain key personnel that you want to make sure that they are identified, and that you are able to kind of create the right incentives in terms of how success looks like, not just immediately after the acquisition, but how do you look at it 2 or 3 years out, so that there's the stability of the organizations that are able to be maintained, throughout that integration. So those are some of the some of the important elements.
So I have like 100 questions that came out of that. So I'm going to start by asking a few that are more near and dear to my heart. My first question is, you outlined all these different pieces that play into the quote unquote good fit. And as a lawyer, one of the things we're taught is don't write anything down if you can help it. Just avoid writing things down. On the other hand, if you want to be able to demonstrate where you started, where you ended, writing things down is critical. When you approach it from a CFO perspective, from a consultant perspective, do you start by going, here's what we're agreeing what a end result should look like, or what the synergies are? Or do you allow for that amorphousness, and that adds value, because as things change, you kind of keep pointing to the new advantages and disadvantages? What do you think is the best practice?
I think having visibility that can be shared by both sides, both the company being acquired, and there's the whole idea of, is this an acquisition or merger? And if there's an acquisition, the mindset is the company who is acquiring is in a leadership role. And then, if you have the general definition is, if you are somewhat of an equivalent, then you're more of a merger. The fact is and everyone wants to feel like this is a mutual decision. Independent of how you want to position it, the reality here is success is going to result in everyone, the combined organization, to really have visibility about what that success actually is. And it should be something that is in a written form. It should allow, an effective, communication amongst all the stakeholders about what success looks like. You want to be able to have validation of that. It's very easy to have a few executives who believe they understand all the operating components to kind of set up a structure up front that all of a sudden creates constraints that doesn't allow success really to be realized. So I'm believe in terms of more transparency. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's doesn't have some control over that transparency, but I rather have those who are at the operating level that have accountability, especially around certain major cost centers, as well as P&L centers, as well as even from a marketing perspective, to make sure that you have clear visibility around what that intent is and understanding what the implications are, from a marketing perspective, from a supplier perspective, so that you don't go down a path that makes it very difficult to reverse. I'll give you an example. There was, we had clients, very large retail pharmacies that were clients, and we were using for all of our data, a major prominent hosting company. And during the process, we realized that one of our major customers was a competitor of the hosting company. And all of a sudden you go down this path that you would think it never showed up as being an issue. But as we started to speak with some of those individuals in sales, they said, no, this is going to be a major issue. And the question here is, are you willing to put that client at risk, which is a major source of your revenue? Or are you willing to rehost a significant portion of your entire data sets into another platform? And again, you would think this would not even be a factor in terms of looking at future state, but these types of conflicts would have never been identified without having a broader inclusion as part of what that future state should look like, and what are some of the potential risks or barriers around that.
So it's interesting. You talked a little bit early on about this conversation of, is it a merger? Is it an acquisition? What size? How size plays a role? I guess my question for you is it always easier? It's one of those things that as we are negotiating these M&A deals, everyone talks about being 50-50 and everyone wants that 50-50 relationship. But the truth is, you can't always be 50-50. There's almost always a leader. And you almost want that because someone has to make decisions. So my question to you is, in your experience, if you are a large holding company, do you want large companies, or do you see the better value add to be a bunch of smaller companies that you can bring together and add synergies? Like, how do you think through the process? How do you help guide these companies think through that process?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it really has to do with, again, what your strategy is. If you are a couple of things I want to kind of react to. One is that most times when you acquire a company, you're acquiring the assets. You're not acquiring the company. You're acquiring very selective assets, and whatever else will persist separate from that acquisition of those assets. So if that's what is typical, then there's typically always an acquirer in terms and then what is being acquired. So that's just a important distinction that many people may not understand. The second is we look at companies that are really best practices. You look at a big pharma company, they typically have a arm within a practice within their pharmaceutical that are looking for early stage assets. So they might be looking at assets that are in a phase 1 or phase 2 or phase 3, and they're looking at those disruptive therapeutics or devices within that earlier stage, typically pre-market, and there is very complex structures in terms of how they may either invest in a particular company until they get to and have first right, or they may have ways in which they feel strongly and they're going to go ahead and acquire that company. So in those instances, they see that as part of their pipeline of research and development around specific therapeutic areas of concentration that strategically they want to focus on. Alternatively, you look at companies that might be well-established pharma companies that maybe they want to get into the generic marketplace, and they're only focusing on branding. So maybe that's a strategic decision to say, hey, I have many drugs that are going off patent, and what I want to do is have a business that I can roll those branded products into a generic form and still be competitive, because cost structures are different, the risks are different, et cetera. And so in those instances, you are looking at typically much larger organizations that are merging based upon, again, strategically, they're looking at what are the opportunities based upon new markets they may want to establish. And so those are some of the distinctions in which, hopefully at the board level and at the C-suite level, those discussions are being made. And they're typically looked at, these are long-term decisions. They're looking at long-term trends. They're looking at certain disruptive technology. We want to get into, gene therapy. What does that look like? I want to get into biologics. What does that look like? I want to get into, wearable technology that can be used as a way of monitoring, a new diabetes drug. So those are all issues in which they're going to look at it from a gap perspective, and also, do I want to make that through organic development, or do they want to acquire as a way of getting there more quickly, knowing though that there are these types of risks?
So let me ask you one last question, because as I expected, we're well past time, but you're just a great conversationalist. So thank you. One of the things that the DOJ has come up with is in March 2023, they actually came back out and they said that here is the criminal division came out and they actually said, here is a plan that we expect you to follow. We expect you to have a strong compliance department. We expect you to have a system. They actually came up with a pilot program, and they said, we want to see employee clawbacks for the salaries and the like if they aren't compliant. We want to see people on your board who are compliance professionals. And if we see a program that works, we see people who are making those good faith efforts, we will consider that if there is a situation where we do need to go prosecute you. A lot of this is great as a concept, but I'm wondering at a practical level, how much of that does get considered in the evaluation of a company? Or do you just go, at a practical level, we just have to take certain risks and we will add those departments in after the fact, but right now we just take what we can and move from there?
Yeah, I think it's, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I would think that's a pretty high threshold you have to be able to show that there's something that is truly fraudulent. As you know, being a bad manager, being a bad board member, there's nothing illegal about just being poor at what you do.
Right.
And clearly, with 50 to 80% failure rate in terms of mergers and acquisition not achieving their goal, not doing it correctly is more of a standard of practice than not. So I think from a compliance perspective, I think everyone has their best intent to, just like any human relationship, everyone goes into a relationship with the best intent. The question though is are you willing to step back and make better decisions? Are you willing to go and adapt the structure or the intent, which does deal with a lot of egos, right? Everyone starts to communicate, this is my intent. The structures are communicated typically up front. You do your best to try to put together the terms of the deal. But the fact is that people then, in many instances, blindly continue through the process. And in many instances, they should have maybe either restructured it differently or be willing to walk away, not as a way of making either party wrong, but just realizing that as a way that you want to maximize value for both entities, this is not going to achieve everyone's intended goal.
I love it, Jeffrey. And we can keep going on this path, but like I mentioned, we're past time. Before we go, how can people reach you?
We have a website, avancer.co, so AVANCO, Avancer, CER, or you can go and just reach me on LinkedIn under Jeffrey DiFrancesco, and then contact me that way.
Thank you for listening to this episode.
Thank you again,
of
Jeffrey,
Darshan Talks.
and
Remember,
can't wait to have
the
you again
information
as
we
we discuss
discuss
more
is for
of
educational
these
purposes
issues,
only
like what
and is
actually
not legal
happens
advice. For
during
additional
the
valuable
actual
insights
M&A
and
transaction.
updates, be sure to subscribe to our
Great.
newsletter
Look forward
at
to it.
DarshanTalks.com. Darshan Talks is powered by the Kulkarni Law Firm.